Hello guys, Cyril here, and today I will show you how to properly solder EC5 and xt60 connectors to batteries. First of all, I'll be using ZP Flightmax 3-cell and 4-cell batteries, and there are several things you should remember when soldering these connectors to high-powered batteries. First of all, some of the batteries will come to you without any connectors or with bullet connectors. And the first thing you have to remember is never ever to try to solder two leads at the same time. So first we'll start with stripping the shrink tubing from the negative lead and solder it to the connector, and only then we'll go on to solder the positive lead. So let's get down to it. One of the key elements of successfully soldering and desoldering connectors from high power leads, as in this example, the batteries have AWG 8 thickness wires, is having a very powerful soldering iron. I'm using an 80-watt iron, and I think that you should not start soldering EC5 connectors without having at least a 50 or 60 watt soldering iron. So also it's very helpful to have homeostats or other pliers to hold on to the connector without burning your fingers, and to clamp the wire with something because the wire will get very, very hot when you are soldering with a very high powerful iron. So let's first desolder this bullet connector. Now we've unsoldered the bullet connector from the negative lead. It's time to form the core of the negative lead with a hot soldering iron so that it fits inside the xt60 connector nicely. The key here is to squish the strands of this multi-strand very thick wire so that it fits better inside the smaller connector. We've done here, and unclamp the wire. Now let's prepare the xt60 connector. For soldering the xt60 connector to a battery, although you'll only use the female part, you'll have to use the whole pair of connectors connected together in order not to alter their geometry while heating, so that when you unplug them, that they will plug together back nicely. So note which part of the connector you'll be using. I use the female part of the connector for the batteries. Plug them together, and let's tin connector posts before soldering the negative one to the battery. When tinning the xt60 connector, apply the heat with the soldering iron to the outside of this barrel, and apply the solder inside rather generously so that the whole inside of the connector is tinned properly. Now the connector is properly tinned, and let's solder the negative wire to the connector. There are some connectors that can be used without heat shrink tubing, but the xt60 connector should be used with heat shrink. It protects the wires from being shortened, and also it makes the attachment much nicer and stronger too. So slide the heat shrink tubing over the negative wire. Check that you are soldering to the negative post of the connector. It has plus and minus signs, and choose the one that has the minus sign on the right part of the connector. You can note that I'm using a soldering or iron with a quite broad tip, so you can apply the heat both to the wire and the connector. Once the solder cools down, inspect the connector and see that the soldered joint is solid with all the wire coated with solder, and and that everything likes rather not neat. And after that, slide the heat shrink tubing over the soldered joint and heat it with a lighter. Tuck all the other wires away and hold the flame under the heat shrink tubing, not very far from it, to heat it properly and not very close, so that it doesn't char or melt or catch on fire. So slide the heat shrink tubing as much as possible to the connector and start applying heat. So now the negative terminal and the negative wire are connected, and only now we can start peeling the heat shrink tubing from the positive wire and connecting the positive wire to the positive terminal of the xt60 connector. Never strip two wires at the same time, because the batteries come pre-charged to about 60%, and in case you connect two wires of this high power battery, it will explode, you'll burn your hands and it will burn your house down. So be very careful and never ever strip two wires of the same battery at the same time. Always connect one wire first and only then connect the second wire. Now let's do the same with the positive wire. Apply the heat shrink, disconnect the second part of the xt60 connector, and there you have it, a perfectly soldered xt60 connector to two very thick wires. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next part where I will show you how to solder EC5 connectors to thick wire leads.